the loss of credibility across the board for all of these international legal institutions bodes extremely badly for, as you have raised, the international legal order.
Natasha Hausdorff is an attorney, an expert commentator on international law, and serves as the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. Natasha has shown great courage in standing up to corrupt and biased intergovernmental law organizations like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice to stand up for Israel and its just war against Hamas in Gaza. Natasha, welcome. I just wanted to start with this question, which is, what is the role international institutions like the UN and the International Court of Justice play in the conflict between Israel and the region in general? Why are they so biased against Israel?
So this has been a developing issue over, I'd say, a number of decades. But of course, the latest manifestation of it has been on Thursday of last week, when the ICC Pre-Trial Chamber 1 issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and also against a Hamas leader, Mohammed Daif, who was confirmed some 3 weeks ago to be deceased.
So they're equating the Prime Minister of Israel with the terrorist, the leader of the terrorist Hamas.
Yes, which
It's
is in and of itself scandalous. But what's even more problematic, I think, for anyone that cares about international law and about rule of law, is that this is a decision that the pre-trial chamber of the International Criminal Court has made without jurisdiction, in breach of its own rules, and very concerningly on the basis of a load of misinformation. The prosecutor of the ICC put before the chamber an arrest warrant application, and he published a public summary of that application. Every phrase of every sentence of that summary was false, and it's been proven to be false in particular by a submission from UK Lawyers for Israel. It's an organisation I'm very privileged to be involved with, that went through line by line and drew on publicly available information to show why what was being cited in terms of this obscene charge of starvation was not only incorrect, false information, but it had also been subsequently debunked by international reports, for example, by the Famine Review Committee. So this is a court that has been ultimately misled, but it is a court also that has made this, issued these warrants contrary to its own rules, where it is required to allow Israel an opportunity to investigate any credible allegations itself. And, as I said, in breach of jurisdiction, because Israel is not a party to the ICC. It never signed itself up to the Rome Statute. There are other good reasons for that, namely that it was very apparent from the very beginning of this process and the drafting of the document that founded this court that it was going to be a political body targeting Israel specifically. That's the reason neither the US nor Israel ultimately joined the court. But critically, this court has essentially proceeded on the basis of finding that the Palestinian Authority is sufficiently able to join the court, which is also not correct. It's not a state. And in any event, it does not have the ability to delegate to the court criminal jurisdiction over Israelis, because the very founding document of the Palestinian Authority, the Oslo Accords, explicitly made clear that Israel was not passing over any criminal jurisdiction over Israelis to the PA. And very, very simply, the Palestinians cannot delegate to the court jurisdiction that they do not themselves have. So at every level, this is a decision which is unlawful, that has been politically motivated and based on entirely incorrect information. And it factors into the sort of lawfare we have seen coming out of, as you mentioned, the ICJ and other UN bodies, international institutions, fueled by, I'm bound to say, an army of NGOs, Ayaan, who have been propagating a great deal of misinformation about international law and about Israel. And it's incumbent on all of us, anyone who cares about international law, about the rule of law, to be pushing back against this very robustly indeed.
And it's actually very misleading, as you describe now, because in the event, hypothetically, that Prime Minister Netanyahu were to land at Heathrow today, would he actually be arrested? What would be, if you just followed their logic, what would happen?
So the invalidity of these arrest warrants aside, if we pause on this argument that the court clearly has no jurisdiction to order these arrest warrants, we come to the question of, what would the UK government do if presented with that situation, which is of course a hypothetical because it's never going to happen, not least because these arrest warrants have been made so public by the ICC. Again, unprecedented, that an application by the prosecutor would be publicly made with a press conference, an interview on Christian Amanpour. All of the fanfare around this is just doesn't accompany other arrest warrants that are issued because they are done in secret so that those subject to them do not know and can be arrested if they go into a member state with jurisdiction to arrest them. Nonetheless, if Netanyahu were to land in the UK, there is very clear domestic legislation here which incorporated the UK's joining the Rome Statute. It is the 2001 ICC Act, and that makes it very clear under Section 23 that the UK would be breaching not just international law and its international law obligations vis-à-vis immunity for Netanyahu as the head of government, but also domestic legislation which has incorporated the provisions of the Rome Statute into the UK legal system, English law, which is that there is respect for immunity for non-parties of the Rome Statute. It is only those states that have joined the Rome Statute that have waived that immunity by doing so.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the reason that the government here has been equivocal about its position when it's been asked, would it enforce arrest warrants, the response has been the UK will abide by international law. My impression from that is it will abide by customary international law that dictates that Netanyahu has immunity and the UK would not seek to arrest him.
All it does is it gives propaganda value to the deterrence of Israel, to Hamas and to Iran.
You're absolutely right, and Hamas, of course, celebrated the decision last week, and it is fueling every Iranian terror proxy. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, its proxies in Syria and in Iraq, and it is also giving a clear indication to these fundamentalists that international institutions will have their back against liberal democracies that are seeking to fight these terror organizations and to preserve their very existence. The essence of the self-defense that Israel is currently engaged in fighting for is under threat. And as I say, it's not just Israel. The international legal system itself is losing credibility rapidly through this politicization and this lawfare, which is an abuse of these legal institutions, but it also necessarily impacts other law-abiding states and their ability to conduct themselves in an appropriate fashion and not find themselves subject to similar lawfare campaigns in the future.
So given what you are saying now, do you believe that the ICJ and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, should continue to exist as a means of upholding the so-called international rules-based order? Is that international rules-based order still in place?
I don't believe that they are upholding the international rules-based order. They are, in fact, doing the opposite. And when we come on to look at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, this is another court that sits in The Hague and it deals with state-to-state relations as opposed to individual criminal responsibility, which is what the ICC focuses on. We have seen South Africa's application, which has been given credibility, this outlandish, obscene allegation of genocide. And we have also seen the provisional measures orders of the court be completely, almost universally misrepresented. If you remember, in January of this year, on the 26th of January, the court issued its first provisional measures order, and it's in The World and His Wife had said, as a result, Israel was guilty of genocide, or plausibly guilty of genocide, or there was a plausible risk of genocide. And of course, none of those were true. And it took the former president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, several months before she had retired, and then she went on Hard Talk on the BBC to dispel all of this misinformation. But I think the point that you're raising is the critical one here. It is essentially part of this propaganda exercise, and it is hand in glove with the misinformation that we have seen on our television screens throughout the mainstream media, that in turn is fueling this mechanism of the weaponization of these courts. And in their current form, I mean, the loss of credibility across the board for all of these international legal institutions bodes extremely badly for, as you have raised, the international legal order.
Yeah. I'm going to, you've answered part of this question, but I just would like you to restate it. What is the one aspect of international law that so many people get wrong in the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank?
So actually, I would probably pick a different aspect of international law. So there's the rule of proportionality in the law of armed conflict, which is universally misrepresented. I'm going to pick two, if I may, very briefly.
Yes.
Because proportionality is certainly not a numbers game. It is not about weighing up casualty figures on both sides. That is utterly macabre. And that also just encourages Hamas to continue seeking to drive up its civilian casualty count, to use civilians as human shields, and in fact to lie about and inflate civilian casualties where it has certainly done so. And there are a number of independent reports that have looked into the fabricated numbers that Hamas is putting out. Proportionality in the law of armed conflict requires that there be a balancing act, and that the concrete military advantage of any particular strike be weighed up against the expected civilian collateral damage. It is an intention-based analysis. It is not an effects-based analysis. And in fact, those states that have been provided with information by Israel as to its targeting and proportionality exercises, the US and the UK included, have consistently stated across the last year that Israel has complied with international humanitarian law. So that's a major misrepresentation. But I think the biggest failing and misrepresentation of international law is in fact in relation to the status of the territory. And this goes back to the very founding of the State of Israel. Because there is very clear international law that determines the borders of states when they gain independence. And it's called uti possidetis juris. It's a Latin phrase. It essentially dictates that the new state just takes on whatever pre-existing administrative lines are there when it declares independence. This is a rule that emerged in the 19th century in South America with the withdrawal of the Spanish. It was applied in Asia and in Africa. It was applied at the dissolution of the former communist federations. And in every instance where a state emerged from a mandate, this is the rule that dictated automatically what those borders were, absent any agreement to the contrary. So this is the default rule. And in 1948, on the 14th of May, when David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, Israel came into being, and it was the only state to emerge from the mandate. And as a matter of the operation of this universally applicable customary international law, uti possidetis juris, automatically Israel inherits the pre-existing administrative lines as its internationally recognised borders. Now, if we look at a map of the British Mandate, on the eastern boundary, that administrative line ran down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea. It incorporated, of course, East Jerusalem and the West Bank. But what happens in this war of independence that is forced on Israel as its neighbours immediately attacked it is Jordan occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Israel, and Egypt similarly occupied Gaza. But in 1967, Israel recovers that territory. And it applies its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to Jerusalem, to the whole of the city, to East Jerusalem in particular. It reunites the city. And in fact, when it did so, Abba Eban, who was foreign minister at the time, writes to the UN Secretary General and says, this is not annexation. You cannot annex what is already your own sovereign territory.
Right. And
that sovereign territory goes back to 1948, to the Declaration of the State of Israel. Every subsequent international agreement, the ceasefire agreements in 1948, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan in 1994, they all reference back to the administrative lines of the mandate. Those are the only lines in play. And there has never been an international agreement to change those borders since Israel's declaration of independence. Now, that doesn't mean that should prejudice what any future agreement looks like, any political resolution, the parties are free to draw whatever borders they choose if they both determine
the
that
negotiations,
to be the case.
there have been endless negotiations, and the negotiations continue.
But those negotiations have to be based on a proper application of international law. And if I just give you one parallel example, because it's, as lawyers, we always try and step back and see where else has this been applied. So with respect to Ukraine, its borders were subject to this principle, this rule uti possidetis juris. And that's why there's general consensus that Crimea was part of Ukraine and Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. But if Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia, in the same way that Israel recovered the West Bank from Jordan in 1967, would anyone accuse Ukraine of occupying Crimea?
No. No, of course not. That is why, because this whole thing is politicized. And the key question here is, for these international agencies that are financed with taxpayer money, if they cannot be a part of the solution, and the solution is to oversee or to help oversee these negotiations that are occurring, and in my view, and I think in yours and many people's, Hamas has to be completely destroyed and dismantled before any kind of peace or conclusion can emerge to this conflict. What should these organizations be doing from a legal perspective alone? The ICC, the ICJ, even the United Nations.
Well, we've not talked about the UN yet, and there is a great
not
deal
any better.
of responsibility that UN bodies carry for the perpetuation of the conflict, in particular UNRWA. You know, we've heard over the last year about UNRWA's complicity in terrorism, about Hamas using UNRWA as a cover for its terror operations, relying on their electricity supply, on their humanitarian aid provisions, that UNRWA employees actually participated in the 7th of October atrocities and have had senior Hamas positions throughout this last year. All of that information has been coming out. UN Watch in particular has been at the forefront of holding them to account. But what people don't seem to understand is that UNRWA has been central to perpetuating this conflict for decades, since it was established, because it runs schools in which Palestinian children have been indoctrinated from kindergarten to believe that the highest calling in life is to slaughter as many Jews as possible and pursue martyrdom. 3/4 of the terrorists who crossed the border on the 7th of October and committed those medieval atrocities, this barbarism, were educated in UNRWA-run schools according to the Palestinian Authority approved curriculum. And the incentivization to terror, it also exists through the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates in this equation, through the pay-for-slay policy, because any terrorist is paid a salary, no matter what banner they coalesce under, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah, the PFLP, they are all paid by the Palestinian Authority, which is funded by the international taxpayer, according to how many Jews they have slaughtered. The severity of their sentence dictates how much money they get. And this incentivization, along with the indoctrination to terror, is ultimately facilitated not just by UNRWA and the other UN bodies, but also by the international community. And ultimately, until the international community comes to terms with that, I don't see how there can be any realistic progress to any form of solution here.
What would you say to the British taxpayers and other countries that are a party, the taxpayers that are a party to these international organizations? Just speaking directly to the taxpayer, not the politicians.
They need to call on their governments to stop Palestinian suffering and Israeli suffering through doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, and through supporting what is ultimately, forgive me, but child abuse. Indoctrinating kindergarten children through arithmetic according to numbers of dead Jews, through physics, explaining how a catapult works, forgive me, a slingshot in terms of firing stones at Jews, through every aspect of the education system. Football teams named after so-called martyrs, terrorists who have blown themselves up and slaughtered Jews.
I've seen some of the material. I've seen pictures of children.
Textbooks.
You know, all outfitted as little martyrs with, blow yourself up kits, put on 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And I've seen the indoctrination. I've seen some of the material that shows that real indoctrination into terrorism takes place, and it is financed through UNRWA. But if you trace the money back, you trace it back to Western nations' taxpayer dollars.
Yes.
That the taxpayer thinks is actually helping Palestinians with food and medicine and schooling and other benign things, not perpetuating the conflict and paying for martyrdom. I'm going to ask you one. I know we're short on time. Just going to ask you one more question. Can you imagine the world without ICJ and ICC? And what would it look like? And even the UN. I mean, there are more and more voices that are coming up and asking themselves, are these organizations now contributing more to, not just in terms of Israel, but are they, generally speaking, are they contributing more to the good of the world or the bad of the world?
So there was a world before the UN and the ICJ and the ICC, and I firmly believe there will be a world after them. If they continue on this trajectory, then I also believe that is ultimately inevitable, because the loss of credibility is palpable. I think we also have to be clear that it's not necessarily a chicken and an egg scenario. So, for example, with the ICC, already in 2012, after 10 years of operation, there was immense criticism that it, at the cost of nearly $1 billion US, had been successful in only securing one conviction. And then in the subsequent 10 years, there were an awful lot of criticisms that it was just focusing on African defendants, and it was a racist court as a result. And in 2020, there was an independent expert review which called out a culture of bullying and fear at the court.
And corruption.
The
disappearing of all of these monies into where?
Well, when one considers that so much of the work of the ICC appears to be done by unpaid interns, I think these are perhaps very, very valid questions. But all of that plays into this sort of lack of credibility and intense criticism, I believe ultimately leads us to better understand the court's current focus on the only Jewish state.
Yeah.
Because everyone, it seems, can get on board with that. And the court comes out rehabilitated and looking very much like the hero in these proceedings. Quite the contrary, though. I think any people who actually understand the issues at play. I myself have been on the ground in Gaza. I have seen the lengths that the IDF has gone to, not just to facilitate international aid into the Gaza Strip, in so many respects far exceeding its international obligations to do so, but also to prevent civilian casualties, again, far exceeding its international law obligations, with the warnings that it provides, and text messages and phone calls to individual householders, dropping leaflets, providing humanitarian corridors, allowing the evacuation and encouraging and supporting that, despite Hamas trying to hamper it. I think when one takes into account all of these issues, then all of this, of course, doesn't depend on the ICJ or the ICC or any other international institution. And in fact, when we recognise that they have only been contributing to the worsening of this situation and the conflict and suffering of the Palestinians.
The suffering of the Palestinians, that's exactly right.
I am still waiting for any of those who profess to care about Palestinian civilians to call, as I have been calling for over 12 months, for Egypt to comply with its international law obligations to facilitate the safe passage of civilians from Gaza fleeing civil disorder in the Gaza Strip. Egypt is a signatory to the African Union Convention on Refugees. It acceded to that convention in 1980, and that convention has a much broader definition of refugee than the International Convention on Refugees.
Yeah.
And if you look at, as I have been along the border between Egypt and Gaza, along the Philadelphia corridor, you see, first of all, the far, far more robust border that Egypt has built with Gaza than Israel had. If Israel had built a similar border, the 7th of October may never have happened, because the border would not have been so easily breached as it was on the 7th. But I also saw Egypt's complicity in arming Hamas. I stood in a tunnel, Ayaan, which was bigger than this room, and there was soot on the walls where this was clearly evidence of vehicles going backwards and forwards, bringing Iranian munitions to continue to supply the Hamas war machine, the terror army that they had built, directly under an Egyptian army command post. The notion that Egypt didn't know anything about what was going on under its nose is simply not credible. And we've seen, I think, reflections in this failure of responsibility on Egypt, on the Lebanese government, and on the international community. There is now talk of a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon, along the lines of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which has not been adhered to in any respect save one, which was the requirement that Israel withdraw from Lebanon. So after the last war in 2006, the international community's assurances that Hezbollah would not be permitted below the Litani River, below the blue line, where it has continued to fire onto Israeli civilian communities, so that they have had to be evacuated for over a year from their homes. All of this ultimately is again at the door of the international community, unfortunately, that they have failed repeatedly to honour their commitments, also under the Oslo Accords, to honour their commitments even after September 11th and the binding UN Security Council resolutions that were passed committing the international community to combating the financing of terror. Where is that when we see what Iran has been doing to finance terror across the region with Israel as the target? And this is the ultimate betrayal, not just of the Jewish state, but I think of the cause of Western liberal democracy.
And of the poor children and women and civilians of Gaza and the other Palestinian territories. The only thing I have seen, the only effort I have seen in my lifetime move the needle on this conflict is the Abraham Accords.
Yes.
To what extent did, I think I know the answer to the question, but I'm going to ask you, was there any international organization involved in the Abraham Accords?
So the Abraham Accords ultimately were born out of people-to-people cooperation and trade links, and all of this had been happening behind the scenes.
And the ICC was not involved.
Of course not. No.
And the UN was not involved. And the European Union was not involved. And none of these so-called international community members were involved in the most important thing that moved the needle in this conflict getting somewhere.
And I think even worse than that, the received wisdom. And I remember listening to John Kerry at the Saban conference in 2016, where he said, "Mark my words, there will never be a separate peace between Israel and the Arab world without a resolution to the Palestinian issue." And boy, oh boy, was he proven to be wrong when the Abraham Accords came about.
Exactly.
But that mentality, that approach, that false analysis of the situation, and forgive me, but it was an arrogance combined with an ignorance,
Yes.
which most likely prevented the Abraham Accords from occurring even sooner than they did. Ultimately, it is economic cooperation, people-to-people cooperation, and critically, de-radicalization that paved the way for this.
And that is I'm going to have a series of podcasts only on de-radicalization. As you know, radicalization is also, Islamist radicalization is present all over Europe and in America now. And so this is a major issue I want to talk to you about. But my last question on this is, we have a new administration coming in January next year, new US administration. And there is, of course, the opportunity to pick up the Abraham Accords from where we left off. What do you see happening based on that? Do you think that peace is within reach?
Well, I'm full of optimism and hope, and I think a lot of what we've already seen in the run-up to the 20th of January inauguration is cause for hope. I'm also hopeful because all of the predictions after the 7th of October of the Abraham Accords falling apart didn't come to pass. And while the situation has been tense and we've seen real tragedy recently with the murder of a Chabad rabbi, the ultimate position from the state-to-state perspective has been that the accords have held, has been that in fact some of the rhetoric coming even from Saudi Arabia is still a cause for hope that there will be the possibility of an agreement between Israel and Saudi in the future. All of this, of course, is ultimately...
Qatar evicted some of its Hamas
Isn't
members.
the timing on that so interesting?
So
soon after the election.
Yes.
Finally, I mean, Qatar has unfortunately been a very troubling influence, not least in having hosted
That's
the Hamas
the understatement
leadership.
of the year.
I try for diplomacy where I can, but also, of course, in its funding of radicalization and of terror ultimately. But let's be clear. I mean, the real force here of so much of the horror across the Middle East is Iran. And having an American administration that is willing to stand up to Iran as the foremost state sponsor of terrorism around the world, and I think show leadership on this issue, so that even the Labour government here can follow through on its manifesto commitment to prescribe the IRGC. I mean, we're still waiting for progress on that, but this is something that they committed to at the last general election. Seeing a seismic shift in the West's approach towards Iran, so that appeasement becomes something, a matter of the past, and there is a show of strength, which is very much needed, not just to deal with the regime there, but also to support the people of Iran, who deserve so much better than the horror that they are currently subject to. And we see flashes of hope every now and again with the resurgence of protests on the street, and we see incredibly brave women standing up for their rights. And I think as an international community, it is so important that we support these ultimately, women's rights across all of these areas, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Tehran, across the Middle East, is a massive, I think, rallying cry. And I really hope that these international organisations, women's organisations, will actually start to perform their mandate and take on the biggest abusers of human rights, of women's rights, across that region, and contend with the real problem that Iran presents for peoples across the Middle East.
I've lost hope in Western women's organizations. I think it's going to come from these Iranian women's organizations, Arab women's organizations, who actually know what it is to be oppressed and know exactly what they are fighting and know how to set their priorities in a different way. But yeah, I'm not too enamored, I'll say, by what I've seen in the last few years.
I can understand that.
For instance, the near silence when it comes to what happened to the women of Israel on the 7th of October.
Yes.
And the making of excuses for what happened, maybe even at times joining in the propaganda of that is coming from Iran and Hamas and all that. So I'm not a big fan of Western women's organizations. I think we need the rise of something else, something new, but it's taking shape.
I hope so, and yeah. I agree with you entirely.
Natasha, I've been a long-time admirer of yours. The courage you have shown is remarkable, and I really want to wish you all the very best, and thank you very much for coming here today and for speaking to me.
Ayaan, the feeling is entirely mutual, and I'm extremely grateful, and look forward to speaking again.
Thank you.